Well, actually, for more on this, we are now joined live by Glenn Deason, who is the Professor of International Relations in the University of Southeastern Norway. Glenn, my first question to you is, now Russia's invasion of Ukraine is now almost completing 2 years in February of 2024. And we've seen a series of back and forth strikes that the two countries have had against each other in the recent past as well. But my question here is, why now? What could be the reasons for Russia unleashing its biggest air attack of the war so far on Ukraine now?
Well, I think that the Russians see the problems that Ukraine is having. So I think they see Ukraine as reaching the breaking point now, in which they have run out of both manpower and weapon systems and ammunition. So I think this indicates, I would assume this indicates that a large Russian offensive is coming. So what you would do then would be to weaken Ukraine in the rear. So, and we saw that most of Russia's targets were these defense facilities, factories producing shells and drones, their weapon depots, their airfields. So I think it has a strategic benefit in terms of putting an end to the war. But you can, of course, also consider it to be a retaliation, possibly, as Russia also hit decision-making centers. According to unverified reports, some of them hosted NATO officers as well. So I guess on one side, they see NATO escalating by sending F-16 and long-range weapons to attack Crimea. So I think that this could be a way of Russia find a way to respond. Just in terms of the size of the attack, I think it would simply have some benefits, because first they send in drones, and then as the Ukrainian air defenses attempt to intercept them, they can discover this air defense system, and then they send more missiles to take out the missile defense system. So I think also the ability to overwhelm is quite tactical in terms of undermining the ability to intercept. Also, this overwhelming use of force also can deprive or reduce the morale among Ukrainian soldiers, which further reduces the fatigue or increases the fatigue among the people who simply don't want to fight this war anymore. So, there's growing pressure also now from the public to find a diplomatic solution to this war.
So what you're saying is essentially that you also read a change in strategy of Russia's offensive here?
Yeah, I think the war has gone through many stages. Keep in mind, when the war first started, the amount of troops Russia sent in had a very clear purpose. It was to force the Ukrainians to implement a peace agreement, because the Minsk peace agreement had been undermined by the Americans for 7 years. So, but then they thought the Ukrainians and Russians were close to a peace agreement. So then, but then in March, April of 2022, the Americans will sabotage this as well to keep the war going, and that's when the war became a war of attrition, which they had to completely destroy the Ukrainian army. And I think this is why it's also been such a horrible, long war with such huge humanitarian toll. And I think now they've reached a point where this objective is more or less reached. They've destroyed all their military hardware. NATO sent more. They destroyed this. They've gone through a few rounds of this. Now NATO doesn't really have that much more weapons or ammunition to send. So I think now you will see probably the Russians going in for a big strike to take out a lot of their weaponry, what's remaining, and then once the Ukrainian army collapses, seize the territory, which they argue that they need, given that NATO rejects neutrality for Ukraine.
Talking about the magnitude of this particular strike, what would you say about Joe Biden saying that the missile strikes in Ukraine show that Putin must be stopped? How do you reflect on that?
Well, I guess the message you want to get across is that this huge attack by Russia demonstrates, that it's very vicious or evil, which makes it more important to stop Russia. So this falls within the common rhetoric, I would argue, from Washington, which is, every conflict it's involved in is framed as a conflict between good and evil. But I think it is also supposed to appeal to the domestic audience, because there's an internal struggle in the United States now in terms of continuing to finance this proxy war in Ukraine. So it's important then to convince the other side. But again, it doesn't really matter if Russia's doing poorly or well on the battlefield. The response by Biden always seems to be more weapons and more wars. So again, this has been going on for so many years now, when all diplomacy and negotiations have been rejected, and the solution is always to send more weapons, even when it becomes evident that Ukraine is, there might be a pending collapse coming. So I wouldn't put too much weight on it, but I think that this will be the main objective, to try to sell an extension of the proxy war by saying that the size of the attack would be, suggest that this would reflect how evil Putin will be, I guess. So it's unfortunately there's still no talks of diplomacy. So.
That's a very interesting point to make there, Glenn, that this could really be targeted at the domestic demography there. Thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast with your updates on this.
My pleasure.